If I may.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in this case, right, the speech of the ruling class, right, is to convince the others that they don't have a voice.
Right.
But is this possible for a liberatory democracy? Is this a viable regime, right? Because as you stated, Alain Badiou, which Ranciere gets a lot from, views the Leninist party state, which is the technical term he uses, as a failure to transition to communism.
Right.
But also that is the form of the successful insurrection.
Yes.
So is there a point in which one can make the working class also the ruling class, to evoke the orthodox Marxist notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat, where there is a transition period where it is the very workers who convince the rich, the elites, the bankers, the politicians that they have only voice and no speech? Like, for example, Saint-Just or Robespierre or Mao under the Cultural Revolution. Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, Ranciere doesn't go in that direction himself. And I think this is exactly why Badiou makes the criticism of him he does, right? Because he says, he's talking about the effects of politics and so forth. He's looking at the shadows rather than the actual thing. For this very reason. He sees him as leveling the right critique, but not taking the actual productive step of going in that direction. But Badiou is, I think, and remarkably going in that direction. So, yeah.
And I noticed you at the beginning you said he had a break with Althusser.
Yeah.
And it's funny that he has this sort of conception of police, like sort of speaking to the people who have voice. I'm just wondering if he totally ditches the notion of the ideological state apparatus, ideological repressive. I can't remember his technical terms for it. Basically, it's the idea that when somebody speaks to you, they speak so indirectly that it gets interpreted by you. You think, hey, they're actually talking to me. I should be identifying with who's speaking towards me. Does he use that at all, or is he just kind of all break with Althusser?
His biggest break is, it's the same break that Badiou makes with Althusser, although Ranciere makes it far more publicly, and that is that Marxism cannot be understood as a science of history. That's the biggest thing he wants to break with. As well as, which again is basically to say there are subjects, there are political subjects. For Althusser, the subject is nothing more than a process of ideology. So that's the biggest thing he wants to break with him. I haven't read La Leçon d'Althusser yet. I haven't gotten my hands on a copy of that, which is where his explicit, full book-length critique of Althusser, which I'd love to read, but is still only in French and long out of print, so tracking down a copy isn't the easiest thing. But it's pretty clear, at least, that those are the big ways in which he's breaking. Marxism has to be the production of conflict, not the recognition of the fact that conflict is what always goes on. That seems to be the biggest thing. Yeah.
So, just as an example, you can tell me if this is appropriate. Would, for example, the teabaggers be a good example of, and I mean that, the political people who follow the teabag movement? Sorry, that's a distinction to be made. Would they be essentially expressing voice but not expressing speech, right? Because even on their demands, right, it's not as though the Republican leadership is particularly taken by their demands or listens to them in any substantive way. So is this what voice looks like without speech?
Yeah, I think that would be fair. I think that would be fair. I mean, I can't think of a place where Ranciere addresses it in those terms. I can't think of a place where he tries to talk about voice without speech. He's so emphatic on saying the task is to assert that there is speech, right? But I'm trying to think of a place where he actually talks about it in those terms. But I think that would be fair when he talks about the structure of oppression, and especially those who choose oppression, right? In this kind of an instance, it would be to choose not to have speech. So I think that would be a fair way of putting it.
Would you also see then, for example, May 68 as a leftist version of this voice without speech?
Yeah, yeah, as does Badiou, right? Although he doesn't put it in Aristotelian terms, but yeah, that's right. This is what it does.
One last. So would this be fairly analogous to the Lacanian passage de l'acte? Or I guess I should
That's
say,
an entire reframing of the question.
Well,
but interesting.
Lacan talks about passage de l'acte. He's a French psychoanalyst, and it roughly translates to something like acting out.
Yeah.
And what you do is you undertake an action because in order to hide your very inability to take any serious action. So for example, like if you're the Weather Underground, you blow up a bunch of buildings to hide the fact that you can't really change anything.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to see if there's an analogous.
Yeah, especially the extreme right. I think that's probably fair. I've never thought of applying that aspect of Lacan to this. Does Zizek do that in some way?
Zizek basically loves passage laïque.
Okay.
Well,
I need to read more
things in
Zizek. I only read 2 of his books. It's a shame.
He has, man,
Yeah.
man, I don't want to have a big, but he has this notion of phonetic communication. We're right when the French workers start overturning cars and burning things. What they're really saying is, hey, we're here, please take notice of us, rather than like, hey, we actually have concrete demands, we want you to change certain things.
Yeah.
It's mostly a frustration with the political leadership, and it's like, hey, pay attention to us.
Yeah, and Ranciere has a fascinating little essay on precisely the tipping of the cars. So he would definitely go there.
Yeah, I mean, but like, wouldn't Ranciere say, precisely when these little teabagging parties come out, and you know, this was something that's very popular last year. They did have all these demands and these sounds, right? And I think if what you're saying is correct about Ranciere, he would try to convince them, no, you're not making any speech. You're making noises. Let me go ahead and tell you what it is that you mean. Which again has Lacanian implications and things like that.
Yeah, that sounds much
like,
more Lacanian than it sounds.
All right, well,
Ranciere.
then, if we're always trying to convince people that they don't have any real speech, right, and yet people are hanging up sounds, and they get up and, if you've ever seen one, there was one in Utah like maybe 6 or 8 months ago. I mean, you get somebody from the Republican Party who, of course, doesn't seem to represent anything. The teabaggers are like, yes, and they're like, yes, I know that you're frustrated because of this and this and this and this, right? And of course, these aren't even the demands that are even close to doing it, because they're just like burning effigies in the crowd and stuff like this. And then there's this sort of like abduction that's going on. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd like to see Ranciere talk on this kind of thing. This conversation is good, right? I don't have anyone to talk Ranciere with usually, so it's making me realize what Ranciere isn't talking about. It's kind of nice, because when I read him, I'm so enthralled with what he is talking about. But I think that's an interesting question. I can't tell how much work Ranciere has done with Lacan, to be honest. I've only come across one reference to Lacan in Ranciere's works, which is pretty startling, that there's only one that I've come across. But I think it would be a fair approach.
Well, maybe I'll ask a question that's more relevant, unless there's other hands.
I have a question.
All right, other hands.
I apologize because I'm not familiar with Raciere's little theory, but could you just quickly clarify the difficulty that he has with the term democracy?
Actually, he wants to use the word democracy. I think that there would be a natural concern with many on the left of using that term because of its association with parliamentary democracy. And when we say democracy, we tend to think something like American politics. But Ranciere wants to use that term precisely and pull it back out of Plato and Aristotle, who criticized it, but at least laid out what it really is. It's this self-naming of the demos, of the people, and their forcing of the disagreement or the conflict between classes.
How does he position himself, or does he position himself differently than a democratic theorist? Because that sounds like that you would follow in line with.
Yeah, for him, what usually goes, I mean, the idea of parliamentary democracy and so forth, that's what he calls parapolitics, the Aristotelian notion, where the people are included as one of so many parties or parts of the political situation. And hence, there's still a facade of disagreement and conflict, but everyone can tell themselves that they're part of the political process because they've cast a vote and so forth, and hence they've done their political duty. And in the meanwhile, nothing emancipatory is actually changed. Nothing emancipatory is going on. So he would see himself as being completely distinct from what usually goes by the name of democratic.
So I would say because most democratic theorists would agree that there's a problem with the word democracy, that representative democracy is a genuine democracy. So he's concerned with a genuine democracy. Right?
Yeah, I mean the kind of democracy that Solon constructed and that Plato and Aristotle saw as so dangerous.
Right? I'm glad I asked because I was a little confused.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked for clarification.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is more along the lines, but I thought about two thinkers while you were doing your speech on that. And